Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, joined today by Chris Hattingh. Chris, how are you doing?
Hi, Nick. Doing well, thanks. 2 days in a row. My colleagues at the CRA have referred to my briefings as they roll me out as the performing monkey in the circus. So here I am for the Daily Friend as well.
Well done. You're much appreciated. Your performances are much appreciated. And also, Sara, how are you doing?
Well, thank you. Nice to be here unexpectedly also.
Excellent. Right. So, unfortunately, we're going to start off with a little bit of a downer story, but it's one of these stories that kind of encapsulates, I think, some of the very deep problems in South Africa. And this is the story of Denny's mushrooms. So Denny's mushrooms has been around for about 70 years. They claim to be one of the biggest, if not the biggest, supplier of fresh mushrooms to the Western Cape, Hattingh, and KZN. And this farm employed 315 people. It's also KZN's largest mushroom farm. And it was burned down in September by an arsonist. The fire damage to the property was extensive, according to people from the farm. And that after a lot of consultation with their existing employees and looking at the environment and the costs, they're going to be laying off everyone. And while they officially haven't said that they are going to be shutting down the farm permanently, people sort of insiders say that it would cost something like 100 million rand to rebuild. It would take at least 2 years, and they're just not comfortable with the environment. KZN, of course, has suffered from the big riots in July of 2021. It suffered from lots of damage and disorder and natural disasters. And so it looks like it's going to be shut down permanently, which of course means all 315 of those people would all have permanently lost their livelihoods. There apparently were lots of issues with certain members of the staff. They had riots where some members of the staff crashed the gates years ago, demanding that they would only hire from Shongweni nearby. So looks like, and the mushroom pickers were earning 8,400 rand a month, which is, I think, better than quite a lot of South Africans earn, especially for the kind of, low-skill work that this is. So, Sara, let me start with you. What do you make of this story? What lessons can we draw from it? And what does this say about the situation in KZN in general?
It's a tragedy. It's not an entirely new tragedy in the sense that very often labor disputes between unions and management, or between in this case a group of workers and management, become heated, take the issue into their own hands, and somebody gets killed or something gets destroyed, and invariably the end result is that the enterprise ceases to exist. So it's a case of, because I understand here that most recently they were demanding 8.5% increases and the company was prepared to give 7%.
That's right.
They didn't like it, so they burned the company down. There's no concern for consequence. There's no concern for whether it'll affect other people badly, whether it may have a permanent effect, as it does. And this is a feature of, this is too great a feature in South African life, and by extension in South African political life, is that the capacity to destroy rather than sort of make the compromise because that is the source of income. Whole numbers of people are going to rely on one person's income, and as you say, they're probably not the worst salaries in the country either. But this is a feature of South Africa, and Natal is probably going to be writ large because Natal's badly governed. It's in a bad state. It's the site of the majority of assassinations. So life is cheap, and it will often, getting rid of an enemy will supersede any other consideration.
So, Chris, what really disturbs me about this is, according to some of the reporting here from, I think it's News 24, is that this actually was it wasn't even a majority of the staff, it wasn't close to majority of the staff, it was just a handful of people who were agitating for the higher wage increase. And yet, firstly, I mean, there was the arson, which no one has been arrested for as far as I understand. But, I mean, there's a bit of a neon sign pointing in a specific direction on that one. But there was also lots of other thuggery that was around this. There was the crashing of the gates I mentioned earlier. But apparently some of the female employees at this farm were given letters, anonymous letters, saying that they must not come to work or they'd be killed while waiting for the bus to travel there. It seems like the sort of gangsterization of much of the South African economy is continuing apace. And this is just another example of it, where a small group of violent people ruin it for everyone else. And what really concerns me is that these people are not necessarily going to be held accountable either by the police or perhaps by some of the disgruntled workers who are probably the retrenched workers who are probably terrified for their lives. What do you make of this?
Oh, it is deeply saddening, but I suppose inevitable. KZN is starting to unfortunately stand out with all these issues, but again, it's the necessary consequence of what has happened with the hollowing out of the police services, of the intelligence services, and just, I think, a general, I mean, it's easy to make generalizations, but sort of aversion to private enterprise and business, and a feeling that that we can destroy things and then the next day we'll be fine again and things will continue on. But I think not really taking cognizance of it took someone years to build a business, to invest, to risk their capital. And this is another incentive for people to not invest in South Africa, be they local or foreign investors of any size. It can be small, medium, large businesses, big corporates, etc. We've already got maybe 1.5% GDP growth this year, if we're lucky, if we don't continue with like stage 5 load shedding, which means much less business activity and fewer jobs being created. So now you add another incentive onto that, a disincentive, for undertaking renewed investment. So we shouldn't be surprised if perhaps this enterprise is now finished and those jobs aren't created again in the future, which in turn forces more people onto dependence on the state, on a measly, 350 Rand. If you really think that's a life of dignity, I mean, then we need to talk about your definition of terms and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, at the CRA, we're working on a strategic intelligence report, our first one for this year, on the operating environment for business in South Africa at this point in time. And this will unfortunately be another illustrative story of this confluence of factors. So declining municipal service delivery, worker and union action at businesses, either sabotage or just making things very difficult, hostile policy, all this sort of stuff points to, I think, short to medium term, very difficult future for many businesses in South Africa, unfortunately.
So, Sara, just staying on this topic a little bit longer, it's easy to blame things like the bad police force, the lack of economic opportunities in general for this kind of behavior. And that's definitely part of the story, right? But I think that, on other podcasts, I've heard this fancy term used, permission structure, which means something similar to what our colleague Gabriel Krauser sometimes means when he says the esteem market, which is what is kind of allowed socially, or what is acceptable in terms of rhetoric and that kind of thing. And if you look, I think you can draw the lines of how something like this can happen straight back to the way that COSATU has poisoned so many of the wage negotiations and business relations in this country. And I'm thinking back to places like the security guard strike in the 2000s, I think it was, when a large number of security guards who refused to go on strike were murdered. And I don't think anyone was ever prosecuted for those crimes. We've also seen other cases where, particularly around mines, when people go out on strike, they get the violence begins. And even if it's not supported by a majority of the workers at a place, anyone who shows up at work will get murdered or harassed or have the house burned down. And this has just continued at pace at the sort of COSATU level. And now it seems to have flowed down into places where, you don't necessarily even have unions operating at all. This is just how, unfortunately, some South Africans think that you do labor relations. Am I fair in that assessment? What do you think?
Yeah, certainly to some extent. I mean, the union, whenever there's been an ugly incident, a murder or an assault, the COSATU, the union movement has always denied that it was their people. I mean, how the hell they could deny it was their people? It's always outside agitators, and that failure to take responsibility, which could make a difference because it could create a whole new set of expectations that can't be sort of exceeded. There's that. I think the other thing is in that space, the unions are not actually in the private space much, particularly COSATU. It's entirely, almost entirely a public sector union, a public sector federation, sorry, and their unions are public sector unions. But I think it's that sort of inevitable sort of rollout of you've got incompetence, you've got inefficiencies, you've got corruption, you've got capture, etc., and it goes along. And because it flows down to that extent, then you end up getting the mafias. And the mafias have really started by taking root in Natal. So it's very possible, I don't know enough of the details of some of the issues that the company faced, but it may very well have been a dispute of, give us 30% of your company or we will. That's possible too, because it is so easy to suddenly, through threats of violence, take what you want rather than work for it. And that once you've got that, it's very difficult to uproot, particularly if your police service is not operating properly. And the problem here is not that the police prevent it from happening; it's almost impossible. But if they were successful in making arrests, in finding people who are responsible, in putting in security, security. I forget what I'm looking for. Spies, essentially, to
Police intelligence.
Police intelligence. Sorry, into the environment, which is not necessarily difficult if you really know what you're doing, and you can absolutely get best information, because that's what worldwide, that's good practice, is informers, police intelligence, etc. But those successes are then likely to diminish the criminal behavior, but you've got to have those successes before you diminish before it has an effect on diminishing the criminal behavior. And in the absence of it, it's a free-for-all.
I think this is the true reality of South Africa. We always like the kind of lazy analysis always divides us up between, like black or white or rich or poor, whatever, or ANC or not ANC. But I think fundamentally is that we're divided between breakers and builders. And these are people who can come from any class, race, political alignment, whatever. On one hand, who are keen to basically just take what they can, and working is for chumps, and the strong win, the weak lose. And the others are those who want to actually build something to add value into the system. And unfortunately, in a case like this mushroom one, it looks like the breakers won, not by having more numbers, but just by using violence.
Yeah.
And I think it's a country's going to work.
And just to say, and other province could well benefit from this, because the purpose, the function, the company will move.
Exactly. Something to keep in mind. Anyway, so let's move on to some comments by President Ramaphosa, who is giving the keynote address at the annual Education Lekgotla taking place in Sandton. I think it was either today or yesterday. And he said that he was very pleased with this year's matric results, which we briefly discussed, I think, earlier in the week. And it shows that poorer schools are gaining ground on more affluent counterparts as a result of government spending on education. He said, quote, "Since Bantu education, which did one of the most terrible damages to our nation's education, we've been improving in poorer schools, and the results are becoming more and more positive. After almost becoming equal to higher, better endowed schools. This is the silent revolution that we have always wanted to achieve." And then he went on to talk about the kind of skills you need in a modern dynamic workforce. He said agriculture, maritime and nautical sciences, electrical, civil, mechanical technologies. These are the things he wants to promote. Chris, you had some thoughts on what the president is calling the silent revolution in education.
If there is, apart from maybe energy and I guess infrastructure, so things like roads, ports, etc., if there is another sector that is maybe the best indictment, not the best indictment, I should say, it's the best example of how effective ANC ideology and policy has been. It is how desperately parents are trying to send their kids to private schools and not public schools. So I agree with the president about a silent revolution, but not of the kind that I think he's alluding to. Not everyone, of course, can afford to send their kids to private school, but if you look at numbers, parents are trying just all the more wherever they can in a very difficult economic environment to send their kids to private schools, because in terms of actual delivery, in terms of better teaching, that on average is happening now in private schools, tied with unions, perverse incentives, all that sort of stuff in public sector schools. It's another example, I think, of this sort of desire for centralization and top-down management to presume that you as a politician and bureaucrat have the knowledge and insight for not 60 million people. I use it as an illustrative example, but to think, I know what skills you need in the future, so I, as the state, I'm only capable of providing this to you. You shouldn't have the power to decide for yourself, maybe to have a voucher to send your kids to a different school and see what works best for them if the school doesn't deliver. I'm going to tell you what skills you need in the future, what sectors are going to grow, where you should get a job, etc., etc. So it points to that sort of hubris, in my view, as well. And then just finally, once again, not focusing and highlighting how many pupils have dropped out of school in that 12-year journey that others have made it through, and credit to them. And one shouldn't say, kudos despite the challenges. They shouldn't have to face these challenges of load shedding and all these sorts of issues on a daily basis, but they do, and some of them make it through, and I think a big credit to them. But a lot of their fellow classmates drop out. The vast majority drop out and are left behind and are not offered sort of opportunities for upskilling, entering a new future-focused work environment. So completely dismissing how the state is failing, I think, the vast majority of young South Africans and leaving them behind.
So, Sara, I mean, I'm a little bit skeptical of some of the claims that you can get from the pass rate, saying, like, for example, as the president is claiming here that poorer schools are catching up to richer schools. I don't know if that's actually true, but and I suspect that the details of that are the devil's in the details there. When you look at something like maths marks, as Chris mentioned, when you look at something like bachelor passes, suddenly I very strongly suspect that you're going to find an awful lot of people kind of being pushed in by moving the goalposts rather than because people are genuinely being better educated. Am I being overly cynical to say that?
Well, let's put it this way, Nick. The question is, if you can't hear a silent revolution, is there in fact a revolution at all? And very quickly, the DA did the maths and said the pass rate is in fact below 55%, taking account people who are sort of fall by the wayside or pushed out of the system to achieve the best results. So in other words, nothing about the schooling is being dealt with. There doesn't appear to be enough concentration on the kids who are not going to go through matric, who are going to go out of school between grade 9 and grade 11. Whatever they do, I mean, I haven't heard the word CETA used for so long. I don't even know, do they exist anymore even? But, let's be honest. In any society, there are very few societies that can have 80% of the kids going to university. University is elite thing, and I mean elite in the sense of very few people have what it takes to go through a university degree and come out with a degree. So there's a variety of education that has to happen after kids leave school, and a certain solid foundation during their school time in order to cope afterwards. I just don't think any of that. I don't know what I mean, this is very Ramaphosa. He says these things, he takes this 80% figure and everything's good and rosy. And it actually is the part of him that drives me the maddest, because it's not, none of it is true. The results have been massaged over the years. Things have got worse. There's so much work that needs to be done. And he's praising, and I'm hoping to God that nobody who's involved actually thinks that this praise means anything, because it's just Ramaphosa being the good guy, full of light and sunshine, and when everything else. But as David says, the EFF are going to build a private. I like that. They're actually building a private school over 5 years. My comment to my colleagues earlier was, why is it going to take so long? But be that as it may, it is not on the left that the answer to our education lies.
Yeah, I must say that one of the reasons why the demand for university education is so high is because everyone knows that without those qualifications that put you in the top, 10, 20% of South Africans, you're not getting a job.
Yeah.
And
Not
that's why
even
everyone is so desperate to
executive
get into
university,
universities.
yeah.
That's
And there's
why.
no doubt. Sorry to say, is that school leaver, university graduates do have a much higher chance of getting a job. But that's obviously impacted upon, sorry to interrupt you, but that's obviously impacted upon the fact that because the ability to create businesses and therefore to create jobs is so circumscribed that people who could get jobs without a university degree, there aren't the businesses or the jobs to get.
Definitely. And also you can see it in the incredible attrition rates in first year in university. When I was in university in the sort of 2012, 2013, the level of fall off was incredible. And that's because a lot of kids who passed matric and got the high enough marks, but were still, despite that, actually failed by their education, went to university and just struggled and just couldn't keep up and probably were left with nothing but debt and regret. That's a little bit too poetic. I didn't mean it to be that poetic. But anyway, any final thoughts, Chris?
Just that, despite, I think, again, what I mentioned earlier, that desire for centralization and top-down management and bureaucratization, people are trying to find solutions regardless. So you're going to see more innovation in the education sector in various ways. We won't necessarily be able to predict it, but that does give me some hope in terms of people trying to, either locally or overseas, trying to find new avenues for their kids to be educated and to equip them better for the future than the state can ever hope to do. So I think the more the state tries to do this, the more speeches and compacts we have from Ramaphosa and his ilk, the more the process is accelerated. It's already been taking place, and I think it's going to accelerate even more.
As with ESCOM. Okay, let us move on to something a little bit lighter, because those were two pretty heavy stories. And this is from one of my most entertaining politicians in the country, Mbalula, who has gotten very upset with the way that some ANC members are talking about ANC chairperson Gwede Mantashe. Mbalula has called for party members to protect Mineral Resources and Energy Minister Gwede Mantashe at all costs, amid criticism over the ongoing problems at ESCOM. Mbalula said that in a recent conversation with Mantashe was complaining as, quote, if he had no hope, and saying that people were, quote, after him, and that Mantashe was under attack from liberals on the issue of energy. He is particularly talking here about the criticism that Mantashe has gotten, particularly from people on the sort of center-left, for his desire to stick with coal energy, rather than switching entirely to renewables. He went on, Mbalula went on to say, there is general anarchy in the organization. When there is a problem, you have 15 speakers and everyone thinks that they have an opinion. There is nothing wrong with comrades talking. I have already addressed former tourism minister Derek Hanekom, and I said, this is how you want to thank us in retirement, that you have an opinion about Mantashe. It might be an opinion that is profound, but don't you think it belongs somewhere else so that we can resolve it, said Mbalula. Chris? What do you make of Vukile's comments?
I wonder what the appropriate forum would be. Maybe it's sort of sending it by bird or by
carrier. Send them a WhatsApp.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sure that they do have many WhatsApp groups within the ANC. Maybe there's one for old veterans and that sort of thing. I do think it's both funny and also good. It just exposes again the sort of lack of capacity and skill within the top echelons of the party. So it's just another example of that as we head towards the general election in 2024. All these examples, I think, are illustrative and useful to show no matter what the situation is, the minister is going to show his lack of skills at every opportunity. I also think some indication of the pressure that they're all feeling, because as far as I'm aware, in the last few weeks, Mantashe, others have said that load shedding isn't the fault of the ANC, but now Vukile is saying some other thing to the other side of it.
yesterday the ANC Youth League was telling us about how it's Eskom's fault.
So, I mean, why would Minister Mbalula feel the need to defend Mantashe in this very vociferous way? I find it all deeply enjoyable, and I think it's useful.
Sara, what I think is really amusing about this is just how it's sort of saying the quiet part out loud, which is that regardless of how much of a mess we're making, of how many mistakes we're making, protecting the image of the organization at this point, after so many years of failure, is by far the most important thing. And that this even applies to people who are retired, like Derek Hanekom. You're not allowed to speak out of turn. It's once again this old ANC trope of prioritizing solidarity, unity over all other objectives.
Well, let's put it this way: judging by the subjects we've talked about, as well as the subjects we thought we might talk about but didn't talk about, there is actually something quite sad about Fikile's plea, because it's like, you know, cartoonists would do better than me, but it's like the ANC has been trampled into the ground as far as its reputation goes, and the various factions are just fighting over a non-existent reputation. I mean, there's nothing to fight for. So in effect, they're only fighting for each other. I mean, Mantashe, have you noticed, is wearing very nice suits at the moment, a pair of glasses, very snazzy, but he's still, you know, he's got a thin skin. So when things get tough, he accuses whites of threatening to do X and liberals are threatening to do Y, and that's where all our faults lie, and that's somehow infested Eskom, and you get the drift. He can't help himself. And Mbalula has to come to his defense, kind of, because Mbalula's on the, you know, on the NEC, and Gwede is his chairman. So
Right,
it's
he's
like,
just behind Gwede in the hierarchy now, isn't he?
Yeah, something like that. I mean, that's it. I rest my case. Gwede, Fikile, and it's all it was is a word salad.
No, exactly.
And all I can think is Derek, if Hanekom, if he's got a modicum of corp, you know, he said, I can't believe what is going on here. So obviously we will not see, we are not going to cease being entertained by Comrade Mbalula anytime soon.
You know, I actually have some sympathy with some of Mantashe's policy positions on this, which is that we need to have, you know, some coal and gas in the mixture. You know, he's still in favor of coal, which we have a lot of in South Africa, and he's still in favor of the car power ships, which could provide some, especially kind of medium-termish relief to the load shedding thing. But it's all kind of a bit sort of pie in the sky because of, you know, the problems with Eskom are clearly so fundamental that having a very animated argument over which power source we're going to use when everything is broken and everything gets stolen 15 minutes after it's put up, and, you know, our new power stations, towers fall over and have hydrogen explosions. It all kind of seems like, you know, this is attempting, at least in my mind, to run a little bit before we can walk. Obviously, you do have to talk about where future power is going to come from because we don't have enough. But Chris, any final thoughts on this?
I don't think of any kind of deep insight. I do think it'll be interesting just what more ridiculousness comes over the next 12 months if we are to again believe new polling coming out from different sources that points to where support for the ANC is going in 2024. I'm sure the sort of pressure is going to get ramped up even higher.
Yeah, just a note on that. There was a news headline today in Business Live, I think it was, saying that there's, I think it's an internal DA poll, which claims that the ANC is below 40% in terms of likely support in the next election.
Can I just add to that quickly? I actually think the ANC's own internal polling has itself way down. I mean, it's like really like hitting yourself over the head.
But I didn't really want to talk about that too much today because I'm always a bit skeptical of these things until you actually see like the poll and the numbers and you can get a feel for its general thoughts. Like, you know, is it doing things like allocating voters who don't have a preference or who say they're not going to vote? These are all interesting things to ask. But anyway, yeah, we live in certainly fascinating times. Anyway, I think that's all we have for the show today. So thank you very much for listening. We hope that you found it interesting, and we will be back next week on the Daily Friend Show. Have a good one.